The very future of the European Union is at risk if it does not do more to help countries hit by coronavirus. That's the warning from the Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte. He's told the BBC's Mark Lowen that the EU needs to rise to the challenge of what he called the biggest test since the Second World War, and says he doesn't regret his country's approach.
Look, perfection doesn't exist in this world. I'm not so arrogant as to think that the Italian government was perfect. But going back, I would do the same again, and I'll tell you why. We have a completely different system from China. For us, to severely limit constitutional freedoms was a critical decision that we had to consider very carefully. If I had suggested a lockdown or a restriction of constitutional rights at the beginning, when there were the first clusters, people would have taken me for a madman.
Does Italy feel let down by the EU?
It's a big challenge to the existence of Europe and to the history of Europe. We're not just writing pages in the books of economics, we're writing pages in history books. This is a big appointment with history and we cannot miss it. Myself and other European leaders need to rise to the challenge. And there's no doubt that if our response isn't strong and unified, if Europe fails to come up with a monetary and financial policy adequate for the biggest challenge since the Second World War, for sure, not only Italians, but European citizens will be deeply disappointed.
If Europe does not rise to this challenge, would the European Union risk failing itself?
There is this risk. If we don't seize the opportunity to put new life into the European project, the risk is real. That's why I won't allow it to materialize. I want to banish it.
Well, let's get the wider reaction to Mr. Conte's comments from around Europe. We'll be talking to our correspondent Gavin Lee in Brussels in a moment. But first, let's speak to Mark, who is in Rome and did that interview with the Prime Minister. How did you find him, Mark? He seemed very bullish, considering everything the country's been through.
Yeah, he pulled no punches, Lucy. A stark warning to Europe and real frustration with other countries in Europe, particularly the Netherlands at the moment, which is blocking the issuing of so-called corona bonds. This is a kind of sharing of debt between EU countries, between EU members, and Italy is leading the group of countries which is pushing for that to happen, saying that countries should not be singled out and the debt burden should not be placed on Italy or Spain's shoulders individually for the pain that it is going through at the moment. But there needs to be a sort of mutualisation, a sharing of debt. The Netherlands is quite against that, and so a finance minister's call on Wednesday was halted because of that. It's going to resume later on today. I have to say the Italian anger would not be assuaged this morning, Lucy, by a headline in Die Welt, the German newspaper, which said that Italy was waiting for the money because the mafia in Italy would make the most of it. It was rubbing their hands in glee, waiting for this money to come from Europe. The Italian government is absolutely up in arms at that headline and has called on the German government to distance itself from that newspaper headline.
And what about Italians in general, not just the politicians, Mark? Are you sensing that there is a rise in anti-European sentiment?
I think there's a feeling that the EU has got its messaging wrong towards Italy during this crisis. A survey that came out last month showed that scepticism towards the European Union had risen from 47% to 67% here in the space of a month. There is a feeling that this kind of wrangling that's going on between eurozone finance ministers is not doing anything for the image of the European Union here in Italy, which is of course one of the founding members of the European Union. And in stark contrast, Lucy, you have countries like Russia, which are absolutely making the most of this for the public relations initiative that they always wanted. They sent planes loads of supplies and medics with the message "from Russia with love." When I put it to the Italian Prime Minister that perhaps the Russian aid came with strings attached, possibly pressure on Italy to do more to lift EU sanctions on Russia, he said that was a huge offence to put it in that way, and that Vladimir Putin, his friend, would never in a million years have put conditions attached to the Russian aid. But I think very, very clearly there is a feeling that while Russia, China, Cuba even have stepped in with concrete support to Italy, there is a feeling that the European Union is not doing enough for Rome, one of its founding members.
Mark, thanks for that. Gavin, Mark's already singled out the Netherlands and their response to this idea of sharing the debt. What about other European countries? What's the feeling?
It's a really interesting dynamic because the Italians, certainly in the meetings with foreign and finance ministers in the past few days in Brussels, are seen to be giving some ground when it comes to acknowledging the fact that if you borrow big sums of money, every one of those 27 governments have to acknowledge to some degree, I think that the message is being made, they will have to pay it back. It's just what conditions are attached. When will you have to pay it back? What interest rates? Italy have a much worse interest rate, for example, than Germany. Italy has been bailed out. Spain has too. Those are the wounds that they're dealing with. And actually, it's interesting, actually, talking to diplomats from Germany and Finland. The Finnish feel quite similar to the Dutch, saying that, hang on a minute, we're not having corona bonds, but nobody's really taking the lead in these 16 hours of talks that they've had screen to screen so far. It's very interesting. The Germans are not taking the lead. Some say they've learnt lessons of being blamed for the Greek crisis in the past. The Finnish are believed to be hiding behind the Dutch, who are very outspoken, and I'm told have really not backed down. They will not have this corona bond system. And it's all about what's in a name. It's become toxic. I think it's dead in the water, corona bonds, because the French are now working on a solution to say, let's have a recovery fund, billions that can be paid back in the distant future. The Dutch are still saying that they want a categoric phased-in approach, as the Italians find an anathema. Let's see where it goes. They're meeting again this afternoon. Right now, I think they have to balance between not committing to having this mutual fund, but not excluding it either. Typical of the EU. Let's see how they do.
Well, while they're disagreeing at the moment, Gavin, obviously on the front lines in healthcare systems all over Europe, there are real battles being fought every day. Is there a bit of good news from Spain today?
Yeah, I think notably that the Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez saying that he believes the fire is almost out, that they are getting to a stage, well, whilst the death toll is still in its hundreds, 600-700. It is lower than it was at its peak a week ago at 950, and the spread level is starting to continuing to decrease. And they are talking about, whilst they're extending the measures of lockdown, easing some areas where people might start be able to go back to work. And that's difficult, isn't it? Because most governments are saying the same thing. The Austrians are probably going to start that next week, opening up basic areas, grocery stores, things like that. And the World Health Organization saying, do not fall into this trap of opening too early and having this second wave of coronavirus. But of course, it's the fight that goes back to this meeting today about the economy and how you protect what is going to be a looming deep recession across Europe. The French have hit it already. My take here is that for this meeting today and how they solve this, there'll be emergency online virtual meeting between EU leaders next week.
Gavin, good to see you. Thanks for joining us from Brussels.